Okay, this is the Replicate Google Sheets Charts activity due for your homework. And in this activity, you will be remaking 5 different charts using Google Sheets. A bubble chart, which looks like this, an area chart, a radar chart, pie chart, and a column chart. Each of these charts that are already here, by the way, are images. So you can use those as a reference. If you want to delete them afterwards, you can, but it doesn't really make a difference. You can just leave them there if you want to. So let's go ahead and start with the column chart, also known as a bar chart. Whenever you make charts in Google Sheets, there may be extraneous information that doesn't actually pertain to the data that you're going to show on your chart. And this first example is just like that. There's some stuff here that we don't need. In our final chart, we just want to show each of the counties. Monroe County, Miami-Dade County, Broward, and Palm Beach, but we don't care about the totals for South Florida, for all of Florida, and for the United States necessarily, at least not for this chart. Also, we don't want to use this big cell that has the sources in it, or the notes that I included for you of the colors and some notes about the type of the chart. This is all extraneous information. So the first thing I'm going to do is select only the data that's actually relevant for the chart. And that is every column, but only the rows that correspond to the years and the counties. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Hopefully you can see that. After I do that, oh, it kind of froze. I'm going to make it smaller again. After you do that, the next step is to click on Insert Chart. Once you insert a chart, it's going to automatically try and guess what kind of chart is best for your data. And in this case, the guess is not quite what we want. What we actually want is just the total number of opioid-related deaths in each county, and we don't need to separate them by year for this example. If we were separating them by year, we might have a line chart instead to show change over time, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is go over here to the chart editor, and in the series section, I'm going to remove each of the years by clicking on the 3 dots to the right of the year label, and then just selecting remove. The only one that should be left is the total. Now you can see, if I close this chart editor, that we're getting a little bit closer to our final desired result. By the way, anytime you exit out of the chart editor, in order to get back, all you have to do is click on the 3 dots at the top right of any chart and then select Edit Chart, and that'll bring it right back for you. So I have the stacked column chart chosen right now in the chart type because that's what Google Sheets automatically selected for me. But if I want to simplify things to actually reflect the reality of what I'm creating, I can change it to a simple column chart. It's not going to change visually, but it's going to let Google Sheets know that, hey, we only have one category here. We don't need a stacked bar chart or a stacked column chart. All right, so from here, we're going to need to go to the Customize section. And in the Customize section, you can do all sorts of things like change the fonts, the colors, and add labels and text. The first thing I would want to do here is change the title because I need an actual relevant title. I'm going to go ahead and call this Opioid-Related Deaths in South Florida. Normally for your homework, I would say, for your articles, I would say I want this to sound more like a headline. But for the purposes of this practice exercise, we're going to just leave this as kind of a more boring title here. I'm also going to go ahead and center this title and make it bold, just like the example over here. I also can add a subtitle in this section. I'm going to select Chart Subtitle. And in the subtitle, I'm going to ask you for each of these charts to put your name in it. So you can start by saying made by your name, typing that out. And then always, 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 whenever you create a chart, you're going to want to add a source for your data. And in this case, we have a few different sources, as you can see here. But the main one is the CDC, or the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So you can go ahead and put CDC. Let's see what I had put in the original. Yeah, that's what I put in the original. So you can go ahead and use that same strategy. I'm going to come back here to the subtitle in order to center the text. And now you might notice that we have some other colors in our example on the right. I've included the hex codes for those colors in the color palette of the Google Sheets tab itself. So you can actually copy these hex codes and then paste them as a custom color for the title, for example. So if I open up the title section and then I change the title text color, I can click on the plus symbol under custom, paste that hex code in, and what that's going to do is select the exact color that I originally used and apply it to the title. We can do the exact same thing for the subtitle. If you want to, you can copy this purple that I had provided for you. If you choose your own color, that's okay too, as long as you practice changing the color to something that is strategic and that you actually, wanted to use as part of your design and isn't just the default. We never want things to just be the default that Google Sheets provides for us. We want to change as much as possible to make this better and more meaningful for our readers. Okay, so the next thing you'll notice is that this is actually supposed to be much taller. Whenever you're making a bar chart or a column chart, it's usually going to be helpful to make the dimension the actual bars are going in larger. So since this is a vertical bar chart or a column chart, it's good to make it vertically longer. That's going to accentuate the differences between the bars and make it a lot easier to tell which one is larger and smaller and to estimate the exact value of the height of each one of them. Okay, so another very important thing, even though I'm always going to tell you to label your axes in this class, in this case, this axis label on the bottom, opioid-related deaths, is not actually relevant to what the axis represents. The axis actually represents the names of the counties. So we can delete this label if we wanted to, because the labels of each bar are already pretty meaningful, or we could change it to counties in Florida. Either way, I would accept for this assignment. But the way that it was originally was just not correct. So I'm going to remove it to match our example over here on the right. And you'll notice that the vertical axis actually doesn't have a label at all. And that's a problem because we need to add more information for this vertical axis. There's no way of knowing exactly what that represents if we don't add this additional information. So I'm going to go ahead and write total number of deaths from 2012 to 2016. This is information that the reader would have no way of knowing otherwise, so it's pretty important. I'm also going to make this a little bit bigger than the default. Usually it's a size 12, and that's just way too small. So at least a size 14 is pretty good practice to make this more readable for the audience. You can also change the axis labels of the actual grid lines if you want to. You can do that by going to grid lines and ticks, or actually by going to vertical axis. Vertical axis. There we go. And then selecting a different label font size. You could also make these bold if you wanted to. We'll practice that in some other cases, but this is just an example of how to make that bigger. I also like to remove the commas by going to the formatting and selecting none. Let's go ahead and make the x-axis labels a little bit bigger too, just by clicking on them and then selecting 14 pixels. All right, this is pretty good. I'm pretty happy with this. One thing that I usually like to do is select the label for that y-axis and bring it closer to the axis that it represents. Things that are related to each other, like an axis and its label, should usually be closer together than things that are not related. So Google Sheets likes to put it a little bit far. You can also do the opposite. You can, if this is where it was before, you can change the size of the graph and bring it closer to the axis label. So either way accomplishes the same result. All right, now let's go ahead and change the colors of the bars too, because right now they're this kind of Google blue, and I think instead that they should be purple. So since I already had the hex code copied, I went ahead and pasted it again. And now I have the correct color over here, okay? Another thing that we're going to want to add is the number that each bar represents to the top of the bar. You can do that in this very same section after clicking on the bars or by going to the series section. And then just check the box next to data labels. You can change the position to outside end, and that's going to bring them outside of the bar. And you can also make them gray so that they're a little bit easier to see, and bold, for example. You can remove the commas by changing formatting to none, and you can make these bigger, easier to read by changing it to 14 pixels. In my example over here on the right, I actually individually took each of these labels and moved them closer to the bar that they represent. Sometimes this is finicky, it's hard to do this in Google Sheets, but if you click on them and you're careful, you can sometimes move them closer to the bar, and that just, in my opinion, makes it clearer what they represent. It makes it more understandable that they correspond to that bar, right? So you can try doing this too. I'm going to go ahead and do that for each of these. All right, pretty good. Now, in this one, in the example, we have the order from least to greatest, and in ours, we have it from greatest to smallest. Either way is fine as long as they are in order, either from smallest to largest or from largest to smallest. I believe that you can change the order in the customize section if you go to the horizontal axis and you reverse the axis order. Oh, but this didn't bring the labels with it, so this is a problem. It might just be that that glitch with the horizontal axis reversing isn't something that was happening before, and that's why I didn't see this particular error. If one of you is able to actually reproduce the original without this problem, then go ahead and give it a shot. Let me know how you did that. But I think that this might just be a problem with Google Sheets right now. So one other thing that you'll notice in the original is that we have a little line in between the bar for each county and the name of each county. You can do this in the grid line and tick section by clicking on grid lines and ticks and then horizontal axis and selecting major ticks. Once you have that selected, you can change the position of the ticks to outside, make them a little bit shorter, maybe 6 pixels long, and then make them thicker as well. So that's going to match the original a little bit better. From here, the only thing that's really missing is for you to add the background color. You can copy that from the hex code that I've provided. It's basically an off-white, like a beige color. And you can do that in the Customize Chart Style section. This is where you can add any kind of background you want, any kind of background color, I should say. And you can also add a particular border, which in this case is the same as the default. So we can go ahead and leave that the way it is. You can also change the font if you want to in this section to some other font that you like, but in this case I've actually kept the original. And with that, you'll be done with this first tab, the first exercise. You can put it on top of the other one if you want to. Okay, for the second chart, you have a pie chart. This chart shows the proportion of students in medical school that have student debt from tuition or other expenses and those that do not in 2016. This is a good use for a pie chart because it's simple. You only have 2 sections. It's easy to read and it conveys parts of a whole. Okay, so again, you really only want the data that is relevant to what you're showing here. And in this case, we're not interested in the proportion from 2010. We're only creating a chart for 2016. So I'm actually going to have you reformat this data in the columns that are next to the existing table, or even down here is fine. Instead of leaving it the way it is now, we're going to have 2 rows, one for no debt and one for debt. This is something that you'll have to type out. I'm going to go ahead and make this larger so you can see, and bold as well. Then we're going to go ahead and copy the values from up here. You can do this automatically by using a Google Sheets function. If you say, okay, no debt should be the same as the value of B4, and debt should be the same as the value of C4. This prevents any human error from copying it over. After that, I'm going to go ahead and give this a background color so you can see that it's different from what was there originally. you only need to copy this new section that you created and then insert chart. You can see that the general idea is the same as the example I gave you, but it looks quite different. And we're going to achieve all of that through customization. So the first thing I want to do is do not leave the default proportions, right? The first thing I want to do is make this a little bit taller. The second thing I want to do is go to customize and then go ahead and add a title. In this case, proportion of students with debt in 2016. We're going to go ahead and center this. And now we're going to add a subtitle. Our subtitle is actually going to be this text that you see at the bottom of the original. It's going to say made by your name. Again, put your name there. And then for the source, you can just put JAMA Internal Medicine. That's kind of an abbreviated version. Okay? And as you can see, it puts that subtitle below the title, but ours is at the bottom in the example. What you can do is you can actually make the pie chart itself a little bit smaller by selecting it, making it smaller, making sure that this is still centered is a good idea. I'm going to go ahead and click it and center it again. And then it's still not quite centered. I'm going to go ahead and move it again. A little bit over to the right, like this. And then I'm going to click on the subtitle and I'm going to move it to the bottom of the screen, the bottom of the actual graph here. And now I can size this up a little bit if I want, just to fill that space. So these proportions are looking a little bit better. I'm actually going to go into the chart style first for this one and change all the fonts, because as you can see, I believe I chose Tahoma for this one. The fonts are different than what the default is. And we can go ahead and change the background color while we're here. I'm going to copy the hex code from over here and then put it into our chart style section, adding a new custom color, pasting in the hex code, and there we go. We've got a nice gray. And if I want to, I can change the border as well while I'm here. Customize, chart style, and then change the border color. These are all just slightly different grays here. Okay. Now, you might notice something's missing here. First of all, this title is a little bit too small. Let's go ahead and make this title a little bit bigger. Not smaller, but let's make this bigger, like 24 pixels. That's pretty good. And let's go ahead and make it a darker color. Maybe a dark gray. That's pretty good. Again, it doesn't have to be 100% the same as the original. I just want you to try your best to replicate what we have there. It might be because the font is different that something is a little different. It might not have been Tahoma. It might have been sans serif or Roboto. Yeah, I believe it was Roboto. But in any case, choose the font that you think looks best. Just make sure that you don't leave the default there. Okay, next, we actually want to change the colors of the pie slices. We want to change the blue to this more subtle blue. This is a really good practice, by the way, if you ever want to make your charts look bigger, not bigger, make them look better. If you change your colors to colors that are less saturated, it's going to give you a chart that looks more sophisticated and credible. It's not going to look quite as put together sloppily, or it's not going to look like you don't know what you're doing if you use colors that are less saturated and more friendly for the user, for the reader of your story. Okay, so now we've got our colors. We still need a legend. Right now the legend is non-existent. So I'm going to click on the legend section and change it to position top. That's going to force the legend to appear, and it's also going to remove those pretty terrible label lines that we had before. Those were pretty useless. However, the legend is overlapping the chart, so I'm going to go ahead and click on it and move it up a little bit. Oops, let's move this up so that it's not interfering with my chart right now. And I'm going to move this pie section a little bit down. That looks pretty good to me. Maybe this could be a little closer, like that. This legend is way too small. Usually Google Sheets makes things too small by default, so when in doubt, make it a little bit bigger. You could even make this 16 pixels bigger, and it would look good. And I'm going to make this bold and gray, just like the original example. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. The only thing we need to do now is make it so that this wedge, the blue wedge, is separated from the other wedge by a bit. In this case, I think 15% is going to look okay, maybe 10% even. Oops, 10%. That's pretty good. And we're going to want to, let's move this down so it doesn't interfere with the legend again. There we go. And I actually want to put some percentages here on top of each wedge. To do that, you can go to pie chart, and then instead of slice label none, go ahead and set that to slice value percentage. And again, you can make this bold, change the color, make it bigger. All of this is good practice to make it easier to read. All right. And with that, you have your replica that looks pretty close to the original. Maybe it's a little bit thinner. I'd be pretty happy with that. Not bad at all. And you can move it on top of the picture over here. For the third one, you are creating a radar chart. This radar chart shows green areas in Milan, playgrounds, dog parks, and community gardens in different zones of the city. The zones are kind of like the neighborhoods of Milan. So you can see, for example, that Zone 8 has a lot of playgrounds, whereas Zone 6 is the one with the most dog parks, and so on and so forth. You can create your own kind of knowledge about Milan by looking at this chart. So first things first, you want to select the relevant data. In this case, that's everything from row 2 to row 5. Once that's selected, make sure nothing else is selected. Once that's selected, go to Insert, Chart. And what it's given us here is grouped bars. And we don't want grouped bars, we want a radar chart. So we're going to have to go to the chart type in the Setup section, scroll down and find it under Other. Once we change this to a radar chart, it's going to automatically update into that same chart type, but it looks different. It doesn't look as nice, it doesn't look as clean. We need to make sure that we resize this and that we change the default settings. Okay? The first thing that I'm going to do here is change the fonts. I'm going to edit my chart, go to Customize, Chart Style, and change the font to Courier New. The next thing I'm going to do is change the title by going to Chart Title here and change this to Green Areas in Milan. And we're going to do the same thing that we did from the other chart. First, I'll center this centered and bold. The same thing that we did for the other chart, give it the subtitle, and we're going to say Made By. Make sure to include your name, and the data source is Open Data Milano, I believe. We're going to center this too, and just like with the previous pie chart, I'm going to move this down to the bottom. That looks pretty good to me. Then we can move this up, the legend here. This time it created the legend for us automatically. And we could resize the actual radar chart. That looks pretty good to me. From here, we'll need to add the background color, which is kind of like a brown. Again, that's in the chart style section, then background color, and I've added a custom color here. And we're going to add that nice dark green for the title. I think that looks pretty nice. We probably want to make the title larger too, because otherwise it's going to lose importance when we're looking at the rest of the chart. I'm going to go to the title section for that, click on Chart Title again, change the color, add a custom color, my green here, and I'm going to make this bigger. Let's go ahead and try 18. 18 is still too small. 24 maybe. 24 looks good. Alrighty, we're getting closer to the final version. One thing that's interesting about this chart is that it actually has meters squared next to each of these labels, and it also has a different number of rings around the center of the radar. So we can change one of these things in the Customize section, but the meters squared, we're actually going to have to add into the data, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. But first, let's go ahead and change the rings. In order to change the number of rings, you'll need to go to the grid lines and ticks section and change it for the vertical axis. Going into the major count option is going to allow you to basically estimate how many levels that axis should have. In this case, we have 3 in our original example, but what that gives us is 0, 5,000, and 10,000, making the rings in the center way too small. We actually want the maximum to be 80,000 instead of 100,000. We can do that by going into the vertical axis settings and changing the maximum value to 80,000. That makes it so that the lines actually reach the edges and our chart space is filled up more efficiently. You'll also see that it's given us a minimum of negative 20,000 in order to make the yellow more visible, the yellow community gardens line. But I actually like this better if the minimum is at 0. So you can go ahead and choose that as well. From here, we can leave the vertical axis section and we can go back to the grid lines and ticks section to change the grid line color to white. That's going to match our original better. And from here, we're actually going to want to change the colors of the lines themselves. So you can do this either by selecting each color one by one, selecting each line one by one, or by manually going into the series section and seeing which options are here. So playgrounds should actually be green, and I'm going to copy the hex code for the green color in order to find it and change that. Again, we go to the series section. In order to do that, we're changing it for playgrounds, and we can add our own custom color here. I'm going to click OK, and that updates the color. We also need our lines to be thicker. So the line dash type stays the same, but the line thickness needs to increase to about 2 pixels. And we need to add points at each of the different joints, so to speak, which are about, I believe, 7 pixels. And instead of circles, I've included hexagons. So you can do that too. Now we just need to do the exact same thing for the other lines. Dog parks, in this case, are a brown. I'm going to copy my brown. Go into the settings again, edit chart, customize, series, change the color, not for playgrounds, for dog parks, add a custom color, and put in the brown. Keep the line dash type, but make the line thicker, and change the point size and the point shape. Okay, we have 2 out of 3. We just need 1 more, which is community gardens. And actually, I believe the yellow that I chose is the same as the default yellow that has popped up on this version. But I'm going to add it as a custom color just in case, just to make sure that it's actually the right yellow and not some other yellow that we have here. Okay, it is the same. So it just stayed the same in this case. That's all right. We're going to change the line thickness, the point size, and the point shape. Now our lines look similar to the original example, pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and change the font color of this subtitle down here because it's very hard to read. Let's make that a dark gray instead, like this. And now the only thing left is adding the meters squared to the axis labels. And like I said before, you actually have to go into the original data in order to do this. So I'm going to move this down. I'm going to select all of these numbers, and I'm going to go to the Format menu. Inside of the Format menu, there are options for numbers, and I'm going to add a custom number format. Now, it's a little bit of a spoiler here because I've done this before, so you can see that what the format is going to look like is already one of the options. But what you are all going to have to do, since you haven't done this before, is type in a number 0. The number 0 represents the original number that you have. And then some quotes. The quotes represent the text that you want to come after the number. And I want it to have meters squared. We're actually going to need to make that little 2 a superscript. So I'm going to just really quickly get a superscript 2 from the internet. Or the squared symbol is another way of writing that. Some of you might already know how to type this on your keyboard. You can just type it on your keyboard if so. Oh, it's not happy about me copying here. Okay, it doesn't want me to copy. That's fine. You can go ahead and find it somewhere else. Right, superscript 2. And there you go, meters squared. Then what you need to do is click on apply. And as you can see, all of my numbers have automatically updated and all of the labels on the chart automatically have this meter squared next to them. And with that, you're done with the radar chart. Okay, next one is the bubble chart. This bubble chart is also known as a scatter plot, and it shows which workers work longer hours and which workers are in richer countries. The question that is at the top of this chart says, do workers in richer countries work longer hours? And what we have here is a bunch of data, but mainly we have two continuous numeric variables. One is GDP per capita and one is annual hours worked by person. Those are the two continuous numeric variables that are ideal for making a scatter plot. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of this data, everything from cell A4 down to cell F36, but not anything outside of that. And once again, I'm going to go to Insert Chart. Now, this did not give me a scatter plot automatically. That's okay because we can change this chart type instead of being column chart to a scatter chart. Or actually, in order to make the bubbles different sizes, to a bubble chart. This is going to give me some error messages, and that's just because of the settings over here on the right. That's totally fine. All you need to do is change the x-axis. Instead of code, you can change it by clicking on it, by the way. You should change the x-axis to GDP per capita. And the y-axis, instead of being the year, is going to be the average annual hours worked per person. So now these are distributed in a certain way. You also are going to want to change the size to match the total population. And the series should be the entity. So now everything is configured correctly along these axes and along the different options. You do not need a legend for this chart because each of the bubbles is already labeled. So actually, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is click on the legend over here and delete it. You can delete it by clicking on Position, None. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is make this bigger. Give yourself plenty of space to work with here. Make it nice and tall, almost like a square size. You can look at the example here for inspiration. Now you'll notice that there's a bunch of white space between the zero baseline and the first bubbles that appear. For charts that do not have any length encoding, so they're not a bar chart, they're not a column chart, it's okay for us to start at something other than 0. And we can do that by changing the minimum value for the axis. I'm going to go to my chart and axis, I'm going to go to my vertical axis here. And we're going to change the minimum value. Instead of being 0, let's see what I set it to. It's going to be 1,250. There we go. And we can allow bounds to hide data. That's totally fine. It's not going to hide any data at this point, but it's fine to leave that option checked. Everything else stays the same. All right. Since we're here, let's go ahead and add the title up here. In this case, what I chose was, do workers in richer countries work longer hours? Okay. This is not necessarily the kind of title that you're all going to be writing. Your titles are going to sound more like headlines, but for the sake of this example, it's totally fine. And we want this to be a different color, black, and maybe a little bit bigger, 24, maybe a little bit less, 22. For our chart subtitle, again, you need to include your name. Go ahead and add your name here. And add the source, which in this case is Our World in Data, which all of you have worked with already. Right, and let's center that subtitle. Looks pretty good. Maybe this could be a darker gray. And I'm going to go to chart style to change the font, just so that we can practice. Let's use Roboto again, or maybe Tahoma. I think Tahoma looks pretty good. Alrighty, one of the main problems with Google Sheets charts is that the axis labels and the grid line labels are too tiny. We're going to change this from the standard up to a larger size of 14 pixels for both axes. Another problem is that there's no label for either of these axes. We're going to do that in the chart and axis title section. I'm going to go to horizontal axis title first, and let's see what I had chosen here. GDP per capita, nice and straightforward. And then we can go ahead and put a $sign in parentheses to show that that's US dollars. You could also put USD in order to explain that that's the currency that you're measuring here. And go ahead and make this italic and a little bit larger. That looks pretty good to me. Move this down a bit because there's all of this extra space. We don't need that space. Let's move it down and make this a bit bigger. All right, I like how that looks. And we still need to make a y-axis label. That's our vertical axis. In our, oops, I'm clicking on grid lines. In our axis title section, there we go, vertical axis title. Let's try that again. There we go, vertical axis title. And we're going to label this as annual working hours per worker. All right. Looks pretty good. In fact, this is the average annual working hours. So we can go ahead and put average. And you can see that just based on the original data behind here. If you look at the full name of the column, you can see that that's what that represents. I've also given this a little bit of less space now. So I'm going to click on this chart again. Go ahead and edit the chart. The labels of the vertical axis were a little cramped, so I've made it smaller to accommodate those. And I actually made these bold, I believe. Instead of 14, let's make them 13, just to make them fit. Let's make these bold as well, and let's give those a 13 pixel font size. All right, so ours is looking close to the example. We need to change the grid line color. You can do that by clicking on the grid lines and then copying the color, which I've provided for you in the color palette. And then going back to the editing, edit chart, and clicking on the grid lines. Sometimes it's easier to click on them than to find the settings, because anytime you click on something in the chart, it's going to take you to the correct place for that setting. After we already add the custom color to one set of grid lines, we can add them to the grid lines going in the other direction. And another thing that we're going to want to do is add in the line, the solid line here for the vertical axis. You can do that by going to the vertical axis settings and clicking on show axis line. That pulls up that line for you. And if you want this last line on the right-hand side, you can see it's not showing up for us. You can go to the horizontal axis settings and add a new maximum value of 60,000. That brings in one more grid line for us at the end and makes this much easier to read. It looks more balanced. It looks pretty good. All right. Now you'll notice that every single bubble on this chart is labeled. But in the original, the one that I've provided for you, not every single bubble is labeled. That's because if you're writing a story, it's more likely that you'll have a particular set of countries that you're interested in, and not every single country is going to be relevant to what you're writing about. In that case, you would be able to remove the labels from the countries that you're not actually discussing in your story and leave only the few countries that you're comparing instead. In this case, because we don't have a corresponding article that goes with this, I'm just going to go ahead and choose random countries that are crowded here and delete the label for them individually. You can do that one by one. So actually, instead of erasing like this, you'll need the border to be highlighted. Click and just make sure only one has a blue line around it, and then hit the backspace key to delete it. So for example, Indonesia and Colombia here are both overlapping. I can delete one of them. I can do the same thing for these other countries that are overlapping, and so on and so forth. Okay? You can choose whichever ones, you can choose whichever ones you think are more crowded, or whichever ones you think should be removed. Just make sure you practice removing some of them so that I can see that you know how to do that. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and remove a few more here. Now none of them are really overlapping, so it's a lot easier. Right? Another thing you'll notice is that some of these bubbles have colors that you cannot see. For example, the light blue for the bubble behind South Korea, it's impossible to see. For any bubbles that you see that have a color that's too light, I would just recommend you go in and individually change them to a color that's actually visible. It's okay to do this because right now the colors are pretty random, and changing them isn't going to change the meaning of your chart significantly. So I'm going to go ahead and just look at the list and see which ones need changing and update them to whatever colors I see fit. This looks pretty good in my opinion. Maybe Myanmar could be a bit darker. All right? And once you've done that, you're done with the bubble chart. I think I forgot to make this italic, so I'm just going to do that really quick, make that a little bit bigger. But that's pretty much it. You have one more chart after that. I'll move this over. One more chart after that, and that's the area chart. The area chart is from a little while back, and it represents COVID-19 cases per 100,000 people from April to July 2021. Oftentimes, if you're dealing with COVID or any other kind of medical topic, you'll see cases of a disease are summarized per 100,000 people. That's just a pretty common summary that you'll see out in the wild. And it helps to compare different populations of different sizes. Because if you compare per 100,000 people, you're standardizing the size. It doesn't matter if one population is larger than the other. You have an overall rate that is comparable across all of these categories. All right, so to create this area chart, I'm going to select everything from A2 in my data sheet all the way to J33. And I'm going to insert chart. Okay, again, it did not give me the right kind of chart, so we need to go to setup, chart type, and change this to a stacked area chart. Some of these things are completely irrelevant for them to be in the area chart. I need to remove date, I need to remove month, and I need to remove some of the different ethnicities and races that aren't in this chart. We don't want to include too many categories because that's going to be confusing. In this case, I've chosen to highlight just a few particularly impacted populations from COVID-19. All right. You can choose to highlight a few different ones if you prefer. You can choose which you would like to add to the chart. That's totally fine. Okay, so I'm removing the ones that I chose not to add to the chart in this case. You'll see that they might not be in the same order as what you see in my example. If you want to change the order, you can remove one of them and then add it back in. And that's going to make it so that it changes the one that was added last to be in the top. So let's say I remove black cases and then I add black cases back in. That's going to go ahead and put that section at the top here. And now I have the same order as the example. Alrighty, so let's change the colors for each of these to match the color palette that I provided. You can also select your own colors if you want. Totally fine. I'm going to go to Edit Chart, Customize Series. And we're going to change this particular section to be a particular custom color. All right. Okay. And then let's get our next color down here. Red. We're just changing the red that's already there, again, to be something less saturated and a little bit more customized. Not all series, just one series. Let's change this to be less bright here. Okay. That seems like it was already actually pretty much there. And so one thing about this color is that it seems to be the same color, but the opacity or the transparency isn't the same. So I'm actually going to change that to 50%. That's something that I might have forgotten to tell you guys for the yellow section as well. So let's do that. And then finally, let's put our purple section in here. Purple color. Copy it over. Go to Edit Chart again. Customize Series. And we're going to change this. Okay. And let's go ahead and give this 50% opacity. Alrighty, so now it's starting to look similar, right? By the way, this same place where you see the series, this is where you can change which side the axis is on. So in our original, it's on the right side. Oh, that looks like it was not happy with that. If you change it to the right side, it matches this, but again, Google Sheets is being a little bit strange. Let's go ahead and make sure that our setup is correct here. Let's change this to a different kind of area chart and then change it back. Let's see if that resets it. Okay, it's not happy about that. This might just be a problem that Google Sheets is experiencing. But just know that overall, it doesn't really matter which side the axis is on. That's just an example of an option that exists here. So I'm going to go ahead and put it back to the left so that it matches our example a little bit better. I'm not sure why that's happening. I hadn't seen that before, actually. But we can just leave it on the left. It's totally fine. Since I'm here, I'm going to go to my vertical axis and change the maximum value to 3000. But I'm actually going to uncheck the box that says allow bounds to hide data because I want that little bit of extra past 3000 to appear. I want to keep that one. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the axis line and format the labels here. Make these a little bit bigger, bolder perhaps, easier to read. The easier to read you make something, the better it's going to be. Okay, now we need a horizontal axis, and it looks like right now we don't have anything along the x-axis. Even though it's correct, it's not showing up for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to add month here. We could also add date, but that's going to be a different format than what I included. So just using month is easier. This might actually be why when we switched the axis to the other side, it got a little bit mad at us. Let's see if that fixes it. Nope, still didn't fix it. All right, that's just a weird quirk of Google Sheets these days. Okay, that's fine. So what we have here is every month that's included in the data, but they're repeated. We don't want them to repeat like this. That's not very useful for us. So we can go ahead and go to the grid lines and ticks section. Again, horizontal axis is fine, and change the major count, in this case to just 3 months. We can also remove the major grid lines because we don't have them in the example over here. I've also gone ahead and slanted these. You can slant them if you want to. You can do that by going to horizontal axis and then formatting the slant here to 30 degrees, for example. That's optional. Just a feature that it's good to know that it exists. All right. One more thing we're going to need to do in grid lines and ticks is add minor grid lines, which are these lighter grid lines in between the major ones. We can check the box. Actually, we need to select vertical axis first and then check the box for minor grid lines, and that's going to automatically space them out nicely, just as you see in the example. All we need to do now is add the legend, the title, and the subtitle. Go ahead and do that. Go to title, chart title. Again, kind of a boring title. I'm going to have you guys write more interesting ones, but this is fine for now. And a subtitle made by, don't forget to include your name, And you can include the data source as well. Alrighty. And finally, I'm going to change, first I'm going to change the settings for the title actually. But I'm going to put my legend over on the right-hand side by changing this to position right. And there we go. Except for the axis being on the other side, this pretty much matches. I'm pretty happy with this. Maybe I would change the font because we don't want to keep the default. We want to always pick something out that we like better. You can pick something here that you think is good. And that's it for this exercise. When you are done working on this homework assignment, make sure that you go to the share button and that you change the settings so that anyone with this link can view. Copy this link and submit this on Canvas. This is the important thing here. If you just copy the link the way it is without changing these settings, I'm not going to be able to look at it. So make sure you change this to anyone with the link can view. Copy that link and turn that in, right? And of course, every time you're working with one of these Google Sheets, you're going to want to, at the beginning, make a copy to your own account. So in case you forgot, I'm just going to review real quick. You can do that anytime by going to File and make a copy, save that to your account, and you can make changes whenever you need. All right, that's it for this. And don't forget to email me if you have questions.